Welcome back to the Animal Highlight, everyone. This is season 4, where we're focused on animals and waste. My co-host this season is Herre de Bondt, who has done research on rats in Amsterdam, crows in Tokyo, and gulls in The Hague. His work has now brought him to London, where his PhD project is concerned with urban bird feeding practices. He's particularly interested in the ways in which non-human animals inform and shape the contemporary city in collaboration with and in defiance of humans. In this episode, we talk about worms. Welcome back to the show, Herre. I'm excited to see who we're going to be talking about today with regards to animals and waste.
Hi, Claudia. Before I tell you that, could you tell me, what do you do with your food waste? When you're preparing food, what do you do with the peels, the stems?
I've got a small bin underneath my sink so it's like a compost bin. So I put all of my bits and bobs into the compost bin, and then once that's full, I take it over. There's a massive compost bin in the street. So Vienna's really good actually with recycling and compost infrastructure and stuff. So I'll take that bin out and I'll empty it into the bin here. Why?
Do you have worms in your compost bin?
Gosh, I hope not. I mean, if I do, I've probably left it there too long, but I don't. I don't normally see worms.
Yeah, because that's what I want to talk about today. Because I found myself thinking about the relationship between worms and what we think of as food waste. Because I was reminded about my grandfather's garden and how he used to manage his food waste. Like you, he also composted his food waste, but he was fortunate enough to have a very big garden in which in the far back, he had this big brown pile of gunk called a compost heap, which was fascinating to 8-year-old me, of course. And like most compost heaps, this pile would have been home to many critters who helped to break down the bits of food waste, making them into potent and useful fertilizers. And today I want to talk about that concept a little bit more.
It's cool that you were fascinated by them. I used to just think they were big piles of dirt, but yeah, sorry, carry on.
Well, they're dirt to us, but not to everyone. Because this process of processing, of composting using animals is called vermicomposting. According to NC State University, vermicomposting is a process that relies on earthworms and microorganisms to help stabilize active organic materials and convert them to a valuable soil amendment and source of plant nutrients. Mm-hmm. So not only does vermicomposting create highly nutritious fertilizer that has far lower CO2 emissions than traditional composting methods, worms' presence and poo also increases the water retention of the soil and lowers its toxic heavy metals.
So sorry, I just want to make sure. So vermicomposting is when animals are actively involved in the composting process.
Exactly, yeah, in which they create this soil, in which they create fertilizer essentially through animals' bodily functions essentially.
Okay, I'm with you.
Conceptually, I just find that very intriguing myself, because these worms, and I do want to focus on worms today, are an essential actor in multi-species production cycle that not only includes worms but also humans and other co-composting organisms. But how does that work? I was wondering, and how do worms turn food into fertilizer? I delved into it, and it turns out worms use these tiny bristles on their bodies to move themselves through the soil and through the scraps of food found in a compost heap. Their burrowing habits then create air pockets that give other organisms, like bacteria and fungi, opportunities to thrive. But they also use their tiny mouths at the front end of their body to just steadily eat through all these scraps of food, like banana or potato peels. They eventually excrete this material, giving smaller organisms, like fungi and bacteria, the opportunity to break it down further. There are over 1 million species of worms on Earth. And
what?
Yeah, it is a lot. I recently heard this fact that out of a quarter of all animals species are beetles as well. So there's just so many.
What, a quarter of all animals? What?
Yeah. I picked this up somewhere. I forgot the source, but there's just all these insects that make up such a big part of the animal kingdom.
And the biomass, I think, in the world. I think we tend to overthink about mammals, but insects make a massive portion of the global biomass and numbers. Anyway, I'm getting distracted, but
Me
like
too.
1 million species of worms is pretty remarkable.
Exactly, yeah. And especially considering that ecologists consider worms a keystone species, they play a crucial role in keeping ecosystems alive and healthy. They eat and poop up to 1.5 times their own weight a day, and they do so by moving through these foods and determining whether they are edible and good foods by using the cells inside of their body and in their skin. After they eat it, their bowel movements result in what we call worm castings, which are capable of increasing the amount of key nutrients by up to 5 times compared to the surrounding soil. Earthworms, of course, are perhaps the most well known, but other species like tiger worms and European night crawlers are known in the composting scene, and I delved into it. There is actually a composting scene for being particularly effective at turning food waste into compost. That is because these species prefer to live on top of soil, where they feed on the decaying material that ends up on the top of the soil rather than in the soil. According to research done by Adi and Noor, worms, very much like me, love coffee. While my coffee consumption mostly results in reaching a deadline, worms can actually turn these coffee grounds into higher quality vermicompost with twice the amount of nitrogen compared to kitchen waste that doesn't have coffee grounds in it. So our food waste doesn't have to be waste at all, but can become food for worms who, when they are done working with it, provide the power to nourish more food, essentially making it a bit of a cycle.
So, sorry, doesn't all food end up? So wouldn't worms end up eating all food waste? Like even my food waste that I throw away ends up in a dump site. Would that also be worm food, or does it have to happen in a very specific place?
I think eventually, if it's not eaten by other animals, but just at a far lower pace, and also not resulting in that vermicompost, of course, because then it would just
Okay,
end up somewhere on the bottom of a landfill. I'm not sure how that works, actually.
that's interesting. Okay.
What's also interesting is that specific forms of vermiculture are being tested, where worms also help break down human waste in flushless toilets in India, Uganda, and Myanmar, which further connects these bodily processes of humans and worms. Because it's not about only eating now, it's also about our defecation.
It's ecological, right? You start to connect, you start to think about eating and pooing and waste all together. You start to really see the complexity of ecology, right? Like
It is.
our poo doesn't just like magically disappear when you flush a toilet. So I think that's really interesting to think about, like how worms and the future of toilets are evolving together. I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah, I think so as well, because we like to think that our waste is just disappearing as soon as it's out of sight, out of
Mm.
mind. But it has such a life afterwards, and it can actually serve purposes.
Mm.
So there's been research done into these flushless toilets by Furlong and his colleagues, who researched that one such trial of flushless toilets in India, where worms offer a helping hand in improving pit latrine toilets. I like the names they came up with for these toilets because they're called either tiger toilets, wormlets, or the somewhat more official vermifiltration toilet, of course. And these toilets use worms not only to turn human poop into the far more useful worm poop, but in this process, they also reduce pathogens that is inherent in human waste.
Mm-hmm.
And they make the toilets less likely to flood as the worms effectively aerate and break down this wastewater.
Gosh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it just has so much potential. Vermicomposting and its potential for cities also reminds me of the Animal Turn episode with Catherine Oliver, where she spoke about urban metabolism. Bodily processes play crucial roles in circulating material as both worms and humans consume and produce food. Humans' urban food waste has the potential to become food for worms, who, after having worked through it, can help nourish new food. But what if, like me, I don't have a garden? Can you still participate in this multi-species endeavor? I think the answer lies underneath your kitchen sink, Claudia, because you can turn that into a worm bin, I've learned, or a wormery as they're called.
Mm-hmm.
They are becoming increasingly popular in cities because unlike a compost heap, wormeries are containers where worms are bred and kept, often for the purposes of creating compost. If you wanted to start a wormery in your kitchen, you would need a sealable container, which would act as the worms' office. And this would then need to be filled with bedding material, such as shredded paper, cardboard. And after this, it's time to introduce your co-composters. To sustain your wormery, these worms then need food scraps that have been chopped up into small pieces, because they are slightly picky eaters, as they'll prefer to eat bite-sized pieces. It's like your mum cutting off the crusts of your sandwiches when you're young. And once you put the lid on, all you need to do to keep going is just to add some more bits of food waste from time to time. And in a few months' time, you'll have very potent fertilizer.
So they just make soil from food waste. They can just be food waste, and the soil, like they eat food scraps, and out comes soil. I mean, I guess that's what fertilizer is. Fertilizer is poop. We've just kind of started thinking about it we've created all these concepts that sometimes we forget about that. But they eat food waste, and out comes the poop, and then we've got good fertilizer.
It's very basic, like if you're describing it this way, but yeah, it is. It's not really soil what they're making. It is fertilizer that can be mixed into soil to make it a lot more, a lot better. But yeah, it is very rudimentary if you think about it. But to me, as I was thinking about this, it also raised questions about non-human workers.
Yeah.
Of course, these worms just live their lives, but vermicomposting, especially when it's done in the confines of a small container, essentially turns worms' existence into labor for our purposes. And we do see this tension in other contexts as well, where animals' work has been used to clean up human waste. This includes training crows to collect cigarette butts in exchange for treats. Think about rats who keep sewage pipes clean by eating fatbergs, and using specific bacteria that help filter sewage water. And if you think about this, then the big question becomes, what are the ethics of using animals to do work for us? And what does it say about how we value non-human lives?
Yeah, that's such an important point because, I think the question about animals and labor becomes also like, you have to think at a species level, you have to think at a community level, you have to think about what the animals want from their lives. And, if you're asking about the labor of a crow, a dog, and a worm, you might be asking very different questions about what they expect from their lives, right? And what is a fair amount of work or fair expectation of work from them. But even just conceptually, the idea that what we do is always done through this lens of labor is interesting.
Yeah, everything has to be productive, and bodily functions or just scavenging is turned into production.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know the answer to these questions. I mean, I think we can go on for hours talking about this. But some scholars are starting to think more about the relationship between animals and labor. Scholars such as Kendra Coulter, who have put forward a vision of creating humane work for humans and animals. You can check out her website, humanejobs.org, to learn more as well.
I think she's also just recently published a book about this as well. Yeah, I think she's got she's one of like the leading scholars on yeah, I'm not involved in the labor stuff, but she's really fascinating.
It is imperative, actually, that we do take time to think about how we work with animals and what is fair to expect from them. I'd like to end this animal highlight with a poem from Danusha Lameris titled Feeding the Worms. He writes, "Ever since I found out that earthworms have taste buds all over the delicate pink strings of their bodies, I pause dropping apple peels into the compost bin. Imagine the dark, writhing ecstasy, the sweetness of apples permeating their pores. I offer beets and parsley, avocado and melon, the feathery tops of carrots. I'd always thought theirs a menial life, eyeless and hidden, almost vulgar, though now, it seems, they bear a pleasure so sublime, so decadent. I want to contribute however I can, forgetting, a moment, my place on the menu."
I love that poem. I've heard it before, and I just love this idea that there are animals in the world that have taste buds all over their bodies, and that can imagine what an apple would taste like all over your body, or like what a completely different sensual experience, or does it all just go to your brain in the same way, and they just process apple as sweetness the same way we think of apple as sweetness just via our tongue? But I really love that poem, and how I think it shows some of those ecological dimensions you were talking about, that we're not separate from these food and waste systems, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, and I mean, how often do you actually imagine being such an animal that is so different from us, like a worm? It's hard to imagine, but I do like this poem in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Well, thank you so much for teaching us a bit about worms today, and for just thinking, I think, about the future of these are really interesting questions, both in terms of the future of toilets and waste management, and what roles other animals play in waste management. I think these are important questions. But as you kind of highlighted there, as we move forward with thinking about how a variety of animals can be laborers, whether they are worms or dogs or crows, we also need to, at the same time, develop the kind of ethical frameworks that think through how they're included in our labor structures. But it's fascinating and interesting. It's complex and it's difficult. There are ethical questions, but it's also just really interesting to see how people are starting to think with animals, in particularly in urban spaces, and the use of waste. So thank you, Herre. This was really, really interesting, and I look forward to having you back.
Me too. Thank you.
The Animal Highlight is produced by myself, Claudia Hirtenfelder, co-hosted together with Herre de Bondt. The editing was done by Herre de Bondt, Christiaan Mentz, and myself. The episode artwork by Rebecca Shen, and the bed music by Gordon Clarke. This is The Animal Highlight with me, Claudia Hirtenfelder.